The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you for joining the 2012 version of the National Park Service and White Nose Syndrome in Bats webinar. My name is Kevin Castle. I'm a wildlife veterinarian with the National Park Service out of Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm going to be the moderator for today's talk. I would like to thank Tim Pinion and Sheila Colwell, who are working in the background, working the controls and feeding questions and that sort of thing. So you won't hear them, but they're playing a very instrumental role. They're also recording the webinar. I'd like to point out that this webinar and the Bats and Building webinar, which some of you may have listened to a little while ago, will be available on the National Park Service intranet site pretty soon. The Bats and Building one is already available, and this one will be made available there as well. We're looking into making them available on our public websites as well. We have to do a little manipulation so that they meet all the public access requirements, but we're hopeful to have those done very shortly too. So go to the National Park Service websites and you should be able to access those. The presentations will be on there as well as the recorded webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, we welcome questions from the audience. You can type your questions into the question box that you have on your screen at any time. At the end of the webinar, we'll get together and have a panel discussion of those questions. Any questions that, whether we answer them or not, will be available on the website as well. We'll have the answers hopefully for you there too. One last thing is, if you happen to have any difficulties, if you're having trouble hearing or seeing part of the presentation, probably the easiest thing to do is just to log out of the program and then log back in. That seems to solve most of the problems that we've had. We're not the experts in webinar, but that seems to help for the most part. So I think that takes care of most of the housekeeping things. Again, please type in your questions and we'll get to those. As we go through the webinar, I'm going to present a little bit of introductory information, just kind of bring everybody up to speed on white nose syndrome in general. And we're going to have a section discussing monitoring efforts that are going on. Laura Ellison with USGS and Tom Rodhouse with the National Park Service will be presenting information about current monitoring efforts. Then we're going to talk a little bit about communication efforts within the Park Service and external to the Park Service. I'll be presenting that information, although Jeffrey Olson with the Washington Office of Communications for the Park Service will be taking over that role when he gets back into town. Very important aspect of white nose syndrome, of course. And then education and outreach information will be presented by Sarah Molina, who's in the Office of Education and Outreach for the Park Service. When we're finished, the members who you see above, as well as Dr. Paul Cryan, research biologist from the USGS in Fort Collins, will be joining us for questions and answers. And if you have a question not specifically related to any of the topics we've covered, that's fine. I think that we have enough folks on the line who can help provide an answer or at least point you in the right direction for an answer. So just to get started, this is a map or a similar map that most of you have seen many times over the last few years. This map is put together by Cal Bichkowski of the Pennsylvania Game and Fish Commission. And it just outlines the spread of white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome was first discovered in New York in February of 2006 when folks looked back at some photographs. And in the last several years, you can see this map sort of documents the spread of white nose syndrome over the last few years. Currently, white nose syndrome has been found on bats in 19 states and 4 Canadian provinces. The fungus that causes white nose syndrome, Geomyces destructans, or its genetic signature, have been found also in Oklahoma and most recently in Iowa, although we haven't seen the disease white nose syndrome in those states yet. Unfortunately, we do expect that white nose syndrome is going to continue to spread, impacting additional populations and likely additional species of bats as it moves. So we're really trying to keep vigilant and keep people informed about this issue. To date, there have been 7 species of bats that have actually shown impacts of white nose syndrome, the disease, and therefore these populations have been impacted in some way. You'll see included on this list are two federally listed species, the gray bat and Indiana bat. The fungus, Geomyces destructans, has been found on cave bats, Myotis bellifer, and southeastern bats, but they have not seen we have not seen the disease white nose syndrome. There are two additional federally listed species that inhabit areas very close to or sometimes the same areas as affected species, and we haven't seen white nose syndrome in these species yet, and hopefully it'll stay that way. A 2010 Deputy Director's Guidance Memo pointed out some of the Park Service roles and responsibilities, and many parks across the country have taken these to heart and have implemented a lot of activities. Primary among these roles that the Park Service is playing are education and outreach, which we're going to hear more about today. The Deputy Director guided us to minimize the human spread and impacts to resources of white nose syndrome. And finally, Park Service has been asked to contribute to an understanding of white nose and its impact on the resources. This is a map I put together, and I apologize if I'm missing some parks, but this is just a map to point out the various parks where white nose syndrome efforts are being made, whether it's in the form of updating cave management plans, providing education and outreach, providing monitoring or other research assistance. So you can see it's pretty widespread. There are almost 40 parks listed on here. The parks that have black stars are the parks where white nose syndrome or the fungus Geomyces destructans has been discovered to date. We expect that number to grow into next winter when bats are starting to show signs of the disease. But parks across the country, as you can see, are taking an active role in efforts to learn about white nose and to manage its impacts where possible. I just want to take a couple of minutes and provide some updates, since I know most of the people on this call are with the Park Service. First of all, there have been some discussions about the decontamination protocols and changes in allowed disinfectants. And even as of this morning, I've been discussing this with our integrated pest management people. And what it looks like we're going to come down to recommending, and this isn't completely official yet, we hope to have a memo coming out in some form in the next week. Virkon S is a product that is approved for use, for example, in foot baths. There's another product that we're looking a little bit more into, but BioSentry Disinfectant 904 also is approved for use in foot baths. So if you're doing large-scale decontamination, these are the products that are going to be recommended. They certainly should work for small scale as well. One of the things that we're going to try, that we're recommending, is where possible, if you're a park where you're screening individuals and you get down to where you maybe have just a few individuals per week, it may be better to provide those individuals with some kind of overshoe or some kind of booty that meets safety requirements so that you don't have to use chemicals. I mean, that's ultimately the goal, is to use as few chemicals as possible. So we'll be getting together again with the IPM folks and working on this to get specific information out to you. But it looks like this is going to be the way to go. Try and make a shift over as soon as feasible. Until then, we encourage you to continue the efforts that you're doing now, but try and make these changes once the memo comes out. Another issue that has come up recently is the use of ultraviolet lights in research projects, and we talked about this a little bit before. I think this is it's a technique that does have some potentially very good merit in trying to detect Geomyces destructans on bats. It's sort of a relatively non-invasive technique to do this. We're still looking into it a little bit, but the main thing to think about when you're using these ultraviolet lights, and we'll provide you some language on our website how you can do this also, but is to remember to protect the bats from the UV lights as best as you possibly can, including their eyes, and protect the people working on the bats as best you can. And I have spoken with our Office of Risk Management, and we do have some specific guidelines that we'll make available to you. So just keep that in mind. The final thing that I want to talk about, just again very briefly, is for anyone who's got bat projects going on within the park, whether it's you're instigating the work or you're working with researchers who are coming into the park, please check with the Park Service Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC. I have the website up here, and we can make that available to you as well. Check with them to make sure that you're meeting all of their requirements. Park Service is doing this so that we're in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act of the United States. So it's important to do this with any project. So hopefully we'll be getting some questions. I see some are coming in already. Thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do now is move on to our first major topic of the morning, and that is talking about white nose syndrome monitoring. I'm going to introduce both of our speakers so that we can just kind of move through, and then they'll pass the baton on as they're finished. Laura Ellison is an ecologist with the United States Geological Survey at Fort Collins Science Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. Her current research includes bat population database project, development of white nose syndrome disease tracking system, and work on a non-invasive technique for bighorn sheep population estimation. Tom Rodhouse will be following Laura. Tom is an ecologist with the Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program, specifically for the Upper Columbia Basin Network group of parks, including parks in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Tom designs and implements projects on a wide range of natural resources, including bats, pikas, small mammals, and even rare plants and plant communities. He's currently involved with efforts to develop a coordinated surveillance and monitoring strategy for the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to turn everything over to Laura.
Hello, everyone. I'll be presenting updates on several national efforts for white nose surveillance and bat monitoring. The outline for this portion of the webinar is to discuss the white nose disease tracking system, the Bat Population Data Project, or BPD, a workshop that happened earlier this year in April in Fort Collins on modeling and monitoring of bat populations. And finally, I'll end my presentation on the status of the efforts to develop a North American bat population monitoring program. A proposal to develop a national monitoring program was recently partially funded through the Fish and Wildlife Service's landscape conservation cooperatives, and we are currently seeking additional support from several other agencies and non-government organizations. The National White Nose Plan identified a critical need for a centralized database for storing and serving data on bat populations. A major goal described in the Data Implementation Plan was to develop a web-based data system for tracking and reporting on the rapid spread of white nose across the U.S. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the Fort Collins Science Center teamed up to develop a disease tracking system which provides a secure national database of white nose sample data and a simple web-based application to assist state points of contact with tracking samples from collection in the field through the laboratory diagnostic process. There are also tight controls on the distribution of these data and the timing of their availability to the public. This website was also designed to provide reliable, real-time reporting on white nose status at national, state, and county levels. Currently, the disease tracking system contains diagnostic results from New York and Vermont, and this fall, the Fort Collins Science Center will be entering the remaining states with diagnostic results, hopefully by the end of December. The Bat Population Data Project, or BPD, is an initiative by our center to foster data sharing and collaboration through a web-based application. The historical bat database includes data on bat population counts from 1855 to 2001, mostly from the literature and from various state agencies collecting count data. The new bat population database effort is currently converting that old database to a searchable web application and is extending its functionality to provide custom spatially enabled data searches, reports, and export services. The bibliographic search capabilities have been migrated to this new BPD, and this allows users to search for citations by species, states, and authors. The architecture of future versions of the BPD will be based on a site visit on a particular date at a location and with various conditions. There will be 3 types of data associated with the visit: roost or roosting count data, capture methods or individual-based information, and finally acoustic survey data. For example, the diagnostic information on bats with white nose will be housed or located in the individual capture part of the architecture of the BPD. There will also be an emphasis in future versions of this database to create partnerships with states, agencies, and individual researchers, which will allow for different accessibility to bat population data and sensitive location information specifically. For certain types of data, like acoustics, our database does not intend to store the actual acoustic files on our servers, but will have metadata associated with those calls. How to deal with the volumes of acoustic data that monitoring efforts will likely accrue is something that we are actively discussing with Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, and Forest Service. The next 3 slides are screen captures of the BPD in its current form. Across the top there are tabs for home or landing page, which describes the history of the BPD and goals of the project. There's a tab for bibliographic searches, a tab for topics such as white nose and wind energy, a species page where specific searches on bat species can be conducted, a data partnerships page, and study locations. So if you hit bat bibliography up here, you'll be directed to this page where you can search in this gray box at the bottom by using any combination of the following search criteria: state, author, date of publication or range of publication, and bat species. You can also specify whether you want the species distribution to be overlaid on a map when you get your results. The following is an example of a search display showing all of the citations that are currently in the BPD. Eventually, these citation lists will be exportable as PDFs, Excel spreadsheets, and various citation software formats. The BPD is currently in what's called a beta testing phase before it becomes officially served online in what's called production mode. Our plan is to have it in official production for users by the end of the calendar year. So I'll switch gears now and discuss a workshop that occurred in Fort Collins in April of this year on monitoring and modeling bat populations. The Conservation and Recovery Group of the National White Nose Plan listed this as a major goal to finish in 2012. The purpose of the workshop was to build off of the efforts that occurred in Estes Park in 1999. There were 26 participants that attended this April workshop, and they were a mix of bat researchers, population modelers, and monitoring experts from academia and government agencies. A report was written that recommended how to conduct colony counts, collect vital rate data or data associated with mark recapture of bats, acoustic and misnetting data, spatial and temporal distributions of bats. Discussions and recommendations were also discussed around critical data management issues, and finally how to come up with a national sampling frame. Based on this April workshop, it was decided that a North American bat monitoring program was needed, especially in light of many conservation issues facing them, like white nose and fatalities of certain migrating species at wind energy facilities. This program needs to be a continental effort, and it needs to be well coordinated. Also, a link needs to be made between site-based monitoring, like what happens at a particular refuge or a national park or a forest, to a much larger geographic scope. This program will require consistent long-term data collection and a commitment by various government agencies to fund the program long-term. Representatives from Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, and National Park Service recently wrote a proposal to develop this program. And as I mentioned earlier, this proposal was partially funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service landscape conservation cooperatives. The proposal asked to fund 3 workshops consisting of a core group of statisticians and biologists. The 3 workshops will take place in the next year, and their purpose will be to design a monitoring program for bats and to produce a document that will be a how-to recipe for collecting different types of bat data at different geographic scales, so that those data can be efficiently scaled up to a national level and we can better assess trends in bat populations over time. If you're interested in these national efforts and would like to receive updates on their progress, please email me at the following address and I'll put you on an email contact list. The USGS will provide updates on these national efforts periodically to the contact list. Thank you, and I'm passing the baton over to Tom Rodhouse with the NPS right now.
Okay, well thanks Laura. Hello everybody. Looks like I lost my, I gotta hit to show my screen, sorry. Okay, so a year ago I started off my presentation from a similar White Nose webinar that we did with the same slide. Carpe Noctem, seize the night was the message. Recognizing that, look, there's a lot of challenges, but we really need to strive for coordinated surveillance and monitoring across the agency. Recognizing that we all do this largely, many of us anyway, as collateral duty. So we had to kind of have patience and all that. Now I'm here to say I have a new title in mind, and sticking with the Latin theme, I've come up with something called Errant Opus in Eum, which, at least according to Google Translate, means we're working on it. And I think what Laura just talked about is fantastic, and Kevin and I have been working with Laura and others on that the development of that national effort and representing the interests of the Park Service. And so we are working on it, and by we I really do mean not just Kevin and me, but a lot of us across the agency, and I'm here to sort of celebrate some big steps forward, and really my mission with this talk is to fan the flames of enthusiasm and keep everybody encouraged that we're making progress collectively as Park Service biologists and other staff. Kevin showed this or a similar slide earlier, but there's a new twist to this one, which is basically giving us a feel for the parks that are actively engaged in some form of surveillance and monitoring. And keep in mind, we don't have all the parks that are doing this represented. This is kind of to the best of our abilities right now, based on some surveys that we've sent out earlier this year. Also, there's some overlap, so there are some parks that could share colors, yellow, red, and blue in some cases. But in general, this gives us a pretty good feel for the network of parks and protected areas within the Park Service or the park system, National Park System, that's coming online, where we really can form what I think could be a real backbone piece of this national strategy that Laura was referring to. It's pretty exciting. All 7 regions of the Park Service are represented, and we have parks from all 7 regions doing stuff now. So you know the coordinated network is starting to gel and up and running. Now we have improved ways to communicate and disseminate updated guidance and new information. These kinds of webinars, and we have regional liaisons that are interfacing with park contacts, and then Kevin serves kind of as a great champion at the BRD level to sort of help disseminate and coordinate new information as it becomes available. We have about 15 or so parks, by my count anyway, that we have information on that are actively doing visual surveys in caves or other hibernacula. Quite a few of these parks are also using acoustic survey methods, using Anabats or Pedersen detectors or wildlife acoustics SM2 units. And then there are a few parks that are using camera and beam break technology, exploring other kinds of techniques for doing surveillance and monitoring. So this gives us quite a foothold in terms of you know, a critical mass of parks that can come together and start to share methodology and protocols, databases, etc., and then ultimately feed into the national efforts and participate with this bat population database in the developing national bat surveillance and monitoring program, which is really, really exciting. And I, again, really want to recognize that the Park Service can and should, and it right now is serving as a central source of development and you know, really form a key part of the backbone to this effort, which is exciting. But the next step now, where I think we really need to focus our attention across the agency, is in putting together best practice guidance, protocols, standard operating procedures, and very importantly, data management infrastructure. This is going to be really important, and the national effort isn't going to do all that kind of work. It's going to provide, for the most part, overarching guidance ultimately, I think the most important part of the national effort is to put together a sampling frame, some sort of a scheme, a strategy where the rest of us can start to kind of hang our pieces of contribution on. I mean, think of a Christmas tree with a bunch of ornaments, and that hopefully the bat population data project can serve as the center of gravity, the hub around which a bunch of agencies and NGOs and other folks come together. But in the meantime, we will need these other kinds of information, the protocols, the SOPs, the access databases that can support kind of interface from the ground up, that helps the actual folks in the field figure out what to do, where to do it, and what to do with their data. So that's going to be really important. And I would like to plug part of our conversation and question and answer session topic to be on this a little bit. I would like to hear more from folks about what's going on across the agency in terms of active development of these kinds of materials that we can share. Just to give you a kind of a sense of what I'm talking about, there is this group of folks that have come together to develop a cave ecology inventory monitoring framework, which is pretty neat. And it's going to reach beyond bats as a topic, but certainly it will cover that. And so this is a good example of the kinds of things that can be developed and can be shared broadly across the agency to help folks come together using similar methods. We have Sean Thomas from Lava Beds, for example, who's involved in this development of this natural resource report, this framework, who's working with me, as a matter of fact, to help us develop standard operating procedures for doing cave counts of Townsend's figured bats in lava tubes. And he started that work for Lava Beds National Monument, and now we're doing it at Craters of the Moon. We hope to be able to share those SOPs broadly, and he's planning to append those to this natural resource report. So I think that's a really nice example of how we can start to develop stuff together and share them broadly and make folks aware that they exist, so we're not reinventing the wheel all the time. Sean and Ted have also, Ted Weller, who's a colleague out here in our part of the world here in the West, he's a Forest Service bat biologist. He has been working with Sean to develop an access database to support the work at Lava Beds. And so my colleague, Gordon Dykes, who's a data manager for the Upper Columbia Basin Network, will take this and adopt it, and work it into place for use at Craters of the Moon, and then hopefully beyond. Places like El Malpais that have similar kinds of cave resource issues, surveillance and monitoring can follow a common path in those kinds of parks. Ted is also helping develop Anabat and Sonobat SOPs for acoustic surveys in Craters of the Moon and elsewhere. We're seeing development of an access database and SOPs by Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues here in our region for dealing with full spectrum call files and processing those data through Sonobat 3.0. Eric Britsky, I'm sure many of you in the East are aware of the work that he's done to develop a decision support tool for processing and assigning Anabat call file IDs, identification of Anabat calls to species or species groups. And this is a huge step forward. Joe Suzak, who's the developer of Sonobat, is continuing to tinker and improve on that as well. So there's a bunch of these kinds of efforts that we as Park Service staff and biologists can take advantage of, utilize, and again, as we hone our efforts and start to document what we're doing and get it peer-reviewed amongst our peers, we really do need to keep an eye out towards sharing those kinds of resources and really helping each other along. So there's a lot of progress. We're still herding cats in many ways, but like I said at the outset, we're making progress. And yet I've come up with I got carried away with Google Translate, so I came up with something else, and I thought this was sort of cool. If you stick in "Let's stick together," what comes out apparently in Latin is "Let's coalescat." So that's almost like a bumper sticker slogan that we could all use. And what I mean by this really is, as agency folks, what I would hope to see us do is continue to move on developing these kinds of best practice documents of one flavor or another Forming regional groups, I think, is an important way to go. It's unlikely that, at least in the near future, we're really going to have everybody across the country all doing the same thing. It's not terribly realistic, but what I think is quite likely, and what we really want to aim for, is developing sort of a manageable few number of protocols and SOPs. These can be connected to, let's say, the bat population database, and that data that are collected and disseminated and made available for regional and national level syntheses can have metadata associated with them that sort of connects those data to the specific methods and SOPs that were used to acquire them and process them. That's really, I think, the vision that's within reach here, and that's pretty exciting. I really do think we're making a tremendous amount of progress, and I'm very grateful for all the folks across the agency. I'm sure many of you on this call that are putting your shoulder behind this effort, and that are, if you're like me, juggling many things, and unfortunately this often falls to collateral duty as time permits, and so progress is slow. We have to be patient and rely on each other collectively to help share the burden, because no one person is going to be able to do this all on their own. And again, keeping in mind, ultimately the goal is to enable us collectively as conservation and parks and protected area managers and resource staff to address questions about the status and trend of white nose syndrome and the bat populations more generally this is the key, at appropriate regional and range-wide scales. Bats move around a lot, and it doesn't often make sense to just sort of focus in on, well, what's happening in my park. What we really want to do is be able to place trends, status and trend kinds of information from parks into broader regional context that's more biologically relevant to what's happening with bats. And so with that, I'll end there, and we'll pass it on, I think, to Sarah.
Hi, thanks very much, Tom and Laura, for presenting that information on monitoring. I'm going to talk now a little bit about Park Service communication efforts. Obviously, this is an important component of any kind of work that we're doing in the Park Service, but I just wanted to kind of give people the idea that you're not in this alone. There are a lot of people from the Park Service working on this issue. And starting really from the top, Bert Frost, our Associate Director, is on the National White Nose Executive Committee. Margaret Wild, who is our Chief Veterinarian, is on the Steering Committee. I'm on the Coordination Committee and also lead the Park Service White Nose Working Group. And most recently, although I haven't had many conversations with him because he's been gone, Jeffrey Olson from the WASO Office of Communication for the Park Service, again, as Tom mentioned, will be doing this as sort of side duty, but he will be helping out with communications both internally and with our partners. Certainly our partners, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, I'll probably forget somebody, has done a tremendous amount of work on communicating their white nose syndrome efforts, and I think the Park Service has done a pretty good job of that as well. But we'd like to be able to tap into that expertise when we can and provide Park Service specific information where we need to do that as well. So there's a group of us who are available to help answer questions and work this through. We also have regional white nose syndrome contacts. Most of you hopefully are aware of who these people are for your region, but to try and break it down a little bit in terms of people will have knowledge of specific parks. This is a list. It will be available on our webpage very soon. So these are people who you can contact as well if you have questions about bats or about white nose in general. Just a quick reminder, when would it be appropriate for someone to contact one of the leads, whether it's a regional lead or a communications lead or me? I mean, you can always contact me. I don't mind answering questions about this. If you have questions about the Park Service guidance memo, any kind of education efforts that are being made, you want to tap into national efforts, please contact one of these people. More in terms of on the ground, if you see bats behaving abnormally or find them in strange situations, please contact someone. I've been getting many, many calls, particularly before and recently after our Bats in Buildings webinar. People are more aware of bats than they ever have been, I think, due to white nose and some other issues. And so if you have any questions about this, feel free to contact me or contact your state biologists as well. If you want to submit bats to a lab, whether it's the National Wildlife Health Center or Southeast Cooperative Disease Study, through our lab, the Colorado State University, or others, contact those labs or contact the Park Service folks, and we can help put you in touch with who the appropriate lab might be. If you get results from a lab and you want to better understand how to interpret those or how that might influence your management activities, let us know, and particularly if it has to do with Park Service units. Obviously, we can hopefully provide you some Park Service specific guidance that will fit within our policies and mandates. And finally, if you plan to contact local, regional, or national media outlets about white nose syndrome information, we'd particularly like to know about that so that we can make sure everybody's on the same page. We'll be working closely, particularly with Fish and Wildlife Service. Ann Froschauer does a fantastic job of coordinating efforts. We're certainly going to tap into her expertise. But it's also, we also need to keep the Washington folks, Bert Frost and all the others up the chain, aware of what's going on so they're not surprised when they read about something in a local newspaper. And Jeffrey will be able to help us with that. Communication is not my number one forte, so it'd be good to have other folks with that expertise involved. And just a note, I think that right now what people are noticing is things are pretty slow for white nose, at least in terms of on-the-ground observations and those kinds of things. And you'll all, I think, remember that most of the activity, most of the new findings with white nose occur in the late winter, early spring. So we'd really like to get geared up to have some communication coordination ready to go, certainly by then. And one of the things that I think is really going to be helpful for that, I took this from something that Ann Froschauer and others had put together. It's just an example contact form that I think parks, it would just be nice if parks could have something like this in place before white nose hits. A list of internal contacts, who's your biologist, all these different people who you might have to contact, the state biologists, Ann Froschauer with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and others who will be appropriate to contact. So this will be, again, available on our website. Fish and Wildlife Service has made this available on their websites also, so we can just kind of tear off of that and not reinvent the wheel. And for now, that's what I'm going to present about communications. I'd like to introduce Sarah Molina now to talk about education and outreach efforts. Sarah is an interpretive specialist with the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. She assists parks, networks, and NRSS programs in communication planning, education, and outreach. Her duties include working with partners to create interpretive products for science communication, developing and delivering training on communicating natural resource topics and issues, and chairing the Outreach Technical Advisory Group. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about education and the role of the National Park Service in educating visitors about white nose syndrome in bats. There are nearly 300 million people visiting national parks, and I did just a quick Google search this morning to see, where caves showed up on, what the top 10 caves were in the United States. And Mammoth, Carlsbad, and Jewel Cave regularly showed up. And so if you think about the number of people that you could reach through through interpretive and education programs in the National Park Service with people coming to parks. It's a lot, I mean, millions of people a year coming to the parks, not to mention the number of people coming and visiting park websites before they actually go to have an experience in a national park. And national parks are also a primary place for education. They provide lifelong learning experiences for people. There have been some recent reports, recent studies looking at where people learn about science, and they say 95% of science is learned outside of the formal education system, and so the National Park Service has a huge role to play in that. If we use this opportunity to educate and raise awareness about white-nose syndrome in bats, and the opportunity for people to gain understanding of why caves are being closed, why they have to go through a decontamination process, it provides greater support for the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and everybody's efforts, as well as ultimately minimizing the potential that these people would be spreading, contributing to the spread of white-nose syndrome. So there are a number of things that parks are doing to educate people about white-nose syndrome in bats. There we go. Park websites, you'll see press releases on their websites. Even parks that it hasn't impacted yet, there's information about why caves are being closed, and as well as information about what you can do to help minimize the spread so that people are prepared before they come to the park instead of being surprised when they get there. Great Smoky Mountains has put together a movie about white-nose syndrome in bats. And then a number of parks are putting together fact sheets and frequently asked questions about white-nose syndrome. So these are all available on their websites as well as at the park, so people have visitors have a better understanding of what this issue is. The Biological Resource Management Division is also playing a role in education and outreach. They've just revised their web page so that there's some more information about white-nose syndrome. They are also working on a series of movies about white-nose syndrome in bats. And this has some fun and interesting potential to reach people and provide them with more information than just a temporary cave closed sign. You'll notice on this slide there is that funny little box down there that you'll start seeing everywhere. And these are called QR codes. And the idea is you can download an app to your smartphone, and they're essentially fancy barcodes. You can scan the QR code and it takes you to some sort of content. What we can do is put these on cave closed signs. We can put them on fact sheets, brochures, site bulletins. We've talked about the potential for use for backcountry permits, so that if somebody is going into the backcountry and it adds to information that they can receive before they go back there about what they can do if they come to a cave. And so these movies there are 3 movies that we are putting together. The first talks about bats as a resource, bats in general. The second talks about the problem, the white-nose syndrome in bats. And then the third focuses on the Park Service's response and what the public can do to help protect bats. Just a question that we have for you guys, and I don't know if you can type it in or if you'd like to just send myself or Kevin an email, is any ideas that you have for distribution in these QR codes. Basically, you can just print them off. We will generate them through a QR code generator, and then you can just print it off and stick it to whatever is appropriate. Or we can put together some stickers that we can mail out. So if you have ideas on ways that we can help distribute this, because it has good potential use, please send them in. And as well as any other ideas that you have for roles that BRMD can play in education. Ultimately, we need the awareness and support of visitors to help minimize the spread of white-nose syndrome. It also minimizes complaints you might receive, and why are caves closed? Why can't I bring the shoes that I wore and why do I have to change? Why do I have to go through the decontamination process? And we have a huge opportunity, and I think a really willing and supportive public that we can reach through education and outreach in our parks. And thank you, Kevin, and everybody for inviting me to this.
Well, thanks, Sarah, and just again like to thank Tim and Sheila and Tom and Laura and Paul Cryan as well, who hopefully we'll hear from shortly. This has been a really, I think, for me, an informative webinar. Putting it together, certainly I've learned quite a lot, and we do have quite a few questions coming in that I'd like to get to. I'd like to leave this slide up during the question and answer time, just so you might have a second to jot down some of these websites. I have our Wildlife Health Branch intranet and internet site, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service White Nose site, USGS site. And I'd also like to point out, hopefully folks are very well aware of this. We've been sending out emails, forwarding emails about this Bats Live program that's happening tonight at 7 Eastern time. They're actually going to be broadcasting live from Bracken Cave in Texas, where the largest known Mexican free-tailed bat colony is, 20 million some bats. I was there a few years ago and watched it. It's quite impressive, and I think that they've really lined up an excellent show. So if you have an opportunity to register for this and sign on, I think you'd find it well worth the time. I'd like to start off by answering. I'm going to hog the microphone for just a moment, if you bear with me, to answer a couple of questions that came in since they pertain to the decontamination protocols that I mentioned early on. One of the questions is, will the new decon products be incorporated into a new U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protocol, or is this just an NPS recommendation? For now, it's Park Service recommendation. However, Carol DeSalvo, who leads up our integrated pest management, is speaking very closely with BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service and Forest Service IPM coordinators to update the information in the decontamination protocol. So it may be that this remains a Park Service specific recommendation, but we're hopeful that it will be put on the Fish and Wildlife Service broader site so that people can have a wide range of products to use. It's difficult to pin down some of these products because, as you may remember, these products are pesticides and they're labeled very specifically in some cases, and to use them in a non-labeled way is actually against federal law. So we're really trying to sort of backtrack and make sure that we're all on board with what's legal. The other question has to do with the specific recommendations of Virkon and the other product that I mentioned, the BioSentry disinfectant. Have those been tested specifically against Geomyces destructans? And currently, the Geomyces destructans has been tested with one of the Virkon products. I'm not sure which product it is. Those results, to my knowledge, have not yet been published. They're in manuscripts. They have not been published in a peer-reviewed journal yet. Once we get those, we'll have a better feel for what was tested, under what conditions were they tested. But I'd like to make a point that what we're looking to do with these decontamination protocols is really try and minimize the risk of our visitors spreading white nose syndrome. We don't expect these products to kill 100% of Geomyces destructans forms. They might, and that certainly is a good thing, but as with all disinfectants, we don't expect to get 100% kill. So we'll be working sort of from that as a baseline. One of the questions that I would like to pose to Laura is in regards to the BPD, and that is, actually, sorry, it goes to Tom. Our Park Service database managers, maybe this is from Tom, our Park Service database managers producing standard operating procedures for bat monitoring. And if they are, how can they get those to us, Tom?
Well, we have a pretty nice data sharing infrastructure already in place, the IRMA portal. And so that's one way that's ready to go. And certainly for those of you that participate with your local network inventory monitoring team, you're probably well aware of that, and that if you're involved in vital signs monitoring of one form or another, then you know that what we do, it's kind of a nice data management culture that's growing within the agency, I think, and that is that we routinely develop access databases for projects, often really before they're approved and ready to hit the ground. And then those are made available and shared. And we have a number of examples beyond BATS where we do have I&M networks and parks coordinating and sharing databases of one kind or another for stuff. And so I think that's one model that's ready to go. And it's one reason why I think the Park Service, I continue to champion to non-NPSers in this conversation that, hey, look, we have in-house capacity. We're really good at this now. We've got a lot of people that have thought hard about how to develop monitoring databases, and we do know how to share it. We know what's involved and that kind of stuff. I know that Laura and her colleagues are talking closely with the data management I&M team at WASO. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization there. So that's, I think, the main part of that.
Great, thanks, Tom. Here's a question for Sarah, and the question is, can these QR codes be distributed to other public land managers outside of National Park Service?
Sure. They can be, I think, distributed to anybody. It's all going to be on the nps.gov website, and basically what the QR codes do is just direct you to where the videos live on the web. The cool thing, from my understanding, is that you can generate different QR codes that'll tell you where people are coming from. So that's just nice from an evaluation standpoint to see where people are scanning them and where they're getting their information. So I certainly think so.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That is certainly our goal, is to make them very publicly available. I think one of the things that is really interesting is what you hit on in terms of we can hopefully use those to detect where people are coming across these things and use that to even better focus our efforts. Here's a question for Paul. We didn't really get a chance to talk about this, but white nose syndrome clearly poses a threat to what look to be more sort of northerly dwelling species of bats. But can you talk a little bit about the threats posed to other species of bats, for example, in the southwestern U.S. From white nose? What is the thinking on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can everybody hear me okay? Kevin, can you hear? Yeah.
Yes.
So far the effects that we've seen of white nose on bat populations in terms of the mortality, mass mortality events, have been particularly distributed in more northern latitudes. They're still seeing mass mortality in southern latitudes, down in Tennessee and other parts of the southeast, of course. We may have seen a slowing of the speed at which the disease affects bats at those lower latitudes. I wouldn't say that we're out of the woods and that hibernating bats down in the southeast, for example, are going to be in the clear because of 2 years of observations made in some winters that were unusual climatically. But as we move farther west and into new regions where we don't yet know the fungus occurs, and we don't yet have any real good handle on wintering populations of bats where they occur. I think at this point the best assumption we can make is that hibernating bats, no matter where you are are going to require similar conditions to hibernate in during the winter. Cold, stable temperatures, and we're fairly certain that high humidity has an important influence on their survival during winter and their ability to hibernate. So even in the West, although it's more arid and there's been speculation that hibernation sites west or southeast may not have the conditions conducive to high mortality like we've seen in the Northeast, where it's very cold and very wet in these hibernation sites. It could, so far as we know, bats probably hibernate in those same conditions, and until we know otherwise, I think it's safe to assume that the fungus has the potential to cause mortality wherever it occurs in North America in hibernating bats during winter. So I don't think we're at a stage where we can assume that any populations are safe or clear of potential mortality in the coming winters.
Great, thanks, Paul. It's it's going to be tough to know. There was a question here that pertains to where funding might come from to help pay for longer-term monitoring of bats, and for individual parks. And one of the points the question raises also is that parks have often had to work with universities or other entities to do that kind of work. And I think that's fine to continue to provide opportunities for non-Park Service people to do the work. Quite honestly, I don't know that the short answer is I'm not sure where additional funding for long-term projects is going to come at this point. But one of the goals of our sort of informal survey to find out what parks are doing what was to figure out the capacity that parks have, both internally and externally, and start to try and link them together so that they can either share equipment or figure out those places where the information gained is going to be the most valuable, and so we can try and help those particular places with any kind of equipment purchases. So I think the main thing is that what we're trying to do is develop this network that's going to give us the best information with the understanding that we may not have too much additional funding available. So if parks have capacity and you didn't see that your park had a star by it on either of the maps, please send me an email. Let me know if you have data on bats that you've collected over the years and it may just be sitting somewhere. Please, feel free to send that my way. I will try and get it coordinated as best I can with Tom and Laura and other folks. So I think any of that information is going to be valuable. We just need to start centralizing it a little bit.
Kevin?
I think that's, yes.
I was just going to add, this is Tom Rodhouse. I was just going to just add, in line with your comments, that the vision, I think, is that we distribute the costs broadly across this network of parks and protected areas and other partners. That if no one person has to shoulder the entire burden, if we share resources and developing capacity, then we can offset the fact that this is largely still unfunded work.
Right. Thanks for adding that. It looks to me like we're at our hour. I would encourage you, again, if you have questions, please send those to me or to your regional contact, and we'd be happy to try and tackle those. As Sarah mentioned, we have recently revamped our white nose sites. They're still in progress. We're trying to update those and provide as much information as we can there. If you're within the Park Service, you should have access to our white nose SharePoint site in the interim, which has a lot of information on it that we will be ultimately moving to our websites to make them more broadly available. So please keep your eyes open for alerts to when that information will be coming out. keep your eyes open for information about the decontamination protocol updates. And again, I thank everybody for presenting and for participating in the webinar, and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.